Okay guys, in this video we're going to talk about speciation. So we're going to start with Allopatric speciation, which is a geographical barrier, and then we're going to talk about Sympatric speciation. So imagine we had, I'll do a big population of individuals. So I'm just going to do little crosses as individuals, but you can imagine there's actually quite a lot of them. And then we've got some over here within our population here. Now, this is quite a mixed population, but imagine we had some sort of physical barrier that formed. So I'm going to put a physical barrier in the middle of our population. So this is a population of one species to start with. And the physical barrier could be anything from a river that forms over time, a glacier maybe, a canyon, some urban development. And it's really anything that prevents gene flow. So here, normally we'd have gene flow between all the individuals of the population. But what we're saying is gene flow is prevented. And what that means is physically the individuals, and I'm going to call this population A on the right, cannot interbreed with the individuals of population B on the left. So they're geographically isolated by a physical barrier. Now, the individuals in population A over many, many years and many generations could, in theory, become a different species to those individuals from population B. Now, if you go back to the definition of species, it's members of a similar group with similar characteristics that can interbreed to make fertile offspring. So why would the individuals from population A undergo natural selection and evolve into a different species compared to the individuals from group B? So we need to introduce the ideas of natural selection. So always in natural selection, you're going to talk about variation within any population, and variation is due to mutation in the DNA. So if you get mutation in DNA, you can get new alleles within a population. Now, the second point of natural selection is that there's going to be some form of selection pressure. So selection pressure is any aspect of the habitat that drives the selection of one phenotype over another. So within this population A on the right hand side, there's variation within the population, that's mutations in DNA. Selection pressures might exist, and it might be the type of food that's available to them. So for example, it might be that it's a population of birds. The only food type within this habitat here are harder nuts with seeds inside. So the birds that have a slightly tougher, bigger beak can crack open the nut, get the seeds. And that means that these individuals with a phenotype have a selective advantage. Now, with the selective advantage, that means that the phenotype, that's the physical characteristics, is advantageous. Now, with an advantageous phenotype, there's always got to be an advantageous allele. That helps to code for that phenotype. So individuals that have a selective advantage will have a phenotype that gives them an advantage. That phenotype is selected for under the particular selection pressure that you mentioned in the exam. That means individuals with an advantageous allele, number 5, are more likely to survive. And if they get to reproductive age, they're much more likely to reproduce. Survival of the fittest. Now, because they're more likely to be able to survive and reproduce, that means over time, they pass on their advantageous allele to offspring who themselves pass on the advantageous allele to their own offspring, so through generations. And number 7, the allele frequency. So you must mention this when you talk about natural selection, of the advantageous allele, so of this allele here, is going to increase within the gene pool. That means there's going to be more individuals with that advantageous allele, and if they've got that advantageous allele, you know, especially if it was like a dominant allele, for example, it would give the advantageous phenotype. So the allele frequency increases within the gene pool over many generations over time. Now, imagine that we had many generations that were developed over time, and we took an individual from population A, and in population B, there was actually, over here, a different selection pressure. That means the individuals of population B might have natural selection, but they're going to evolve, their mean phenotype is going to change and going to evolve to suit the particular selection pressure that exists in this habitat here, which might be, for whatever reason, different from that population A. So it could be that the food type is different here for that population of birds. It might mean that there's softer fruits, for example, as opposed to the harder nuts. So the beaks of these birds might, you know, evolve for a directional selection for a more longer, elongated, smaller beak, possibly. So why can't these interbreed? So if you take a female from population A and maybe a male from population B, and you interbreed them, but they do not make fertile offspring, then we can start to think that maybe they've evolved into separate species. But we also need to know why they can't make fertile offspring. So there's other ideas that we're going to bring in. So, for example, if you took the female and the male from the two different populations, which we now think have evolved into different species, they can't make fertile offspring. And it could be pre-zygotic, or it could be post-zygotic. Now, this is the isolating mechanism that stops them making fertile offspring, or just stops them interbreeding in the first place. So it could be, for example, that the sperm of the male, so the gametes from the male, are just not compatible with the reproductive tract of the female. So the vagina of the female, depending on the type of animal, could be incompatible or too acidic to allow survival of the sperm. It might be that chemoattractants that are released from the secondary oocyte of the female don't attract the male sperm anymore, so they're not going to swim towards the secondary oocyte, so you don't get fertilization. It could be morphological. So it could be that the reproductive organs are simply not compatible anymore. So mechanically they don't match together, they're not compatible, so therefore they can't reproduce. So these two ideas here, that the gametes are not compatible and anatomically they're not compatible, would be pre-zygotic. Now, one more example of pre-zygotic would be courtship behaviours differ. So it might be mating calls to the females or mating calls to the males, depending on which way it works, are not now recognised by the other sex of that species, and therefore they can't interbreed. So courtship behaviour might be different. So the female of population A might not recognise a mating call or the coloration of the feathers, for example, of a male from population B, so they can't reproduce. And again, that's pre-zygotic. Now, another one that we could look at is, imagine they did actually manage to produce an offspring. It would be a hybrid. So the female from A and the male from B actually did interbreed to make an offspring, but the hybrid that's formed is sterile. That means it can't make its own gametes. And if it can't make its own gametes, it's sterile, which means it can't make its own fertile offspring. So that's not going to happen at the top. Now, the reason that some of the hybrids cannot make gametes, they're sterile, it's called hybrid sterility, is because even though the offspring are diploid, that means they've got two sets of chromosomes. The chromosomes are not homologous. So the germline cells within the hybrid animal, they would have chromosomes that might not be homologous. So imagine you had these two chromosomes, because they're different sizes and they've got different genes. Obviously different genes will all be in different locations. These cannot form a bivalent. So because there's no homologous chromosomes, or you've got odd numbers of chromosomes, they cannot form bivalents. Now, if they can't form bivalents, that means that prophase 1 cannot finish, and therefore you don't get metaphase 1, anaphase 1, telophase 1. So they're all prevented from happening. And if these things don't happen, it means that these hybrids, which are sterile, cannot make gametes because meiosis cannot finish. So it's called hybrid sterility. Now, the other one is called hybrid inviability. And that means that the embryo that forms as part of the hybrid as it develops is not going to develop as it should do, and therefore actually the embryo dies off because it can't develop as it should do normally. So actually the hybrid embryo is it's not going to develop into a full-term organism. Now, the only difference really with the allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation, if we go back up to the diagram on the left, what you'll find is with sympatric, there isn't any physical barrier that separates two populations, but that each population becomes isolated because they have a preference for a certain habitat. So this group on the right, A, wouldn't necessarily be physically isolated from population B, but these individuals, maybe fruit flies within a forest, for example, might have a preference for pears on a pear tree as their food source. And the offspring of this population would also have the same preference. But the individuals of population B might have a preference for apples and apple trees within the forest. So their offspring tend to have the same preference for that particular food source. So these individuals in A tend to interbreed together, and the individuals in B tend to interbreed together because they've got these nuances for their habitat. And over time, they are going to evolve to become separate species to the point where you take individual male and female from each population and they cannot make fertile offspring. So in sympatric speciation, the isolated groups are called demes. There's no physical barrier, but they have different preferences for certain habitats, which makes them isolated. And they evolve differently to the point where they can't make their own fertile offspring if you take members of the different species now.